Still More Stories from Grandma's Attic by Arleta Richardson, illustrated by Dora. Chapter 4. The Dog Who Could Spell. One afternoon, as Grandma and I were looking at some old pictures in her album, I noticed something strange. There were no casual photographs like the ones I was used to seeing. They all looked as though they had been taken in a studio. Most of our pictures were, Grandma said when I pointed this out to her. Families didn't usually have a camera of their own. They were too expensive. Often visiting photographers came around to take our pictures. She turned one of the photographs over. Some of them were printed on postcards that could be sent through the mail, like this one. But most of our pictures were on heavy cardboard for framing or mounting in an album. We didn't have a lot of pictures taken, but I think we have some of everyone in the family.
I wish you had one of Pep, I said. He really was a nice old dog, wasn't he?
We thought so, Grandma agreed. All of us talked to him as though he could understand every word we said. Come to think of it, she added, I believe he did know what we were talking about. He was just like a little child, though. If it didn't suit him to understand, he wouldn't. If it was to his advantage, he had no trouble at all. Ma would sometimes get awfully annoyed with him, especially when he tracked up her floor or tried to sneak into the boys' room. But I remember one time when she actually hugged him.
He must have been doing something pretty special,
I said.
What was it?
Grandma eased back in her rocking chair, and I knew she would tell me another story. When it was cold, Pep was allowed to sleep on a rug beside the stove. Ma wasn't entirely in favor of that arrangement, but the boys and I pleaded his cause, and Pa was on our side.
He doesn't take up much room, he said. As long as he behaves himself, I don't see why he shouldn't stay in at night, now that he's getting older.
So Ma consented, and we were pleased. Pep seemed to know that his good fortune depended upon his behavior. He was a model dog on cold winter nights. One evening in late fall, we were sitting around the supper table. Pep was lying on his rug near the stove. He had his nose between his paws, and he appeared to be asleep. Reuben looked at him fondly.
Do you remember when we brought Pep home?
He asked Ma.
Brought him home?
I asked.
I don't remember when he wasn't already here.
Reuben looked disgusted.
Of course you don't, silly. You were only 2 years old. We didn't even live in this house then.
Ma laughed. You can be sure I remember. I almost killed the poor thing before I knew what it was.
Oh, Ma! I gasped. How could you?
It certainly wasn't on purpose. The boys had been down the road at the Gibbses' place. Reuben was only about 6 years old. When Mr. Gibbs offered him a puppy, he accepted happily. He never thought to ask us about it.
That's right, Reuben put in. The puppy was so small and cute, I just knew we had to have him.
A thump on the floor told us that Pep was listening, even though he didn't open his eyes. Reuben continued.
On the way home, Roy mentioned that Ma might not let us keep him. I hadn't even thought of that, but the closer we got to home, the more likely it seemed. I decided to get him in the house without Ma seeing. We could save enough from our meals to feed him, and we could keep him hidden in our room.
The boys slept up in the loft, Ma explained, above the kitchen. Somehow Reuben managed to sneak that puppy up the ladder and into the loft. That evening, when it was time for Pa and me to go to bed, I went up the ladder with a light. I always checked to be sure the boys were covered. I set the light down by the bed and leaned over to pull Reuben's quilts up. Suddenly, the blankets at the foot of his bed began to bob up and down. "Oh, James!" I hollered. "Come quick, there's a rat in Reuben's bed!" I grabbed the first thing that came to hand and began beating on the lump in the bed. If there hadn't been so many covers over him, I would have knocked that poor dog senseless. Pa came running up the ladder and yanked back the quilts. There was that puppy looking so woebegone that I almost cried. Of course, Reuben was wide awake now. He howled so loudly that Roy woke up and joined in. If we'd had any close neighbors, I'm sure they would have all been there. Finally, Ma said, everyone was settled down. There was no way I could get rid of that pup after scaring the wits out of him. So we put him in a box by the stove. He's been with us ever since."
There have been times, Pa chuckled, when your ma thought maybe she did knock the sense out of him. Sometimes he doesn't act too bright.
"Oh, no, Pa," I protested. "Pep is awfully smart. He even knows how to spell." "That's right," Reuben agreed. "He really does."
"Now that I'd like to see,"
Ma said skeptically.
"I'll admit he's smart enough to know that it's warmer inside by the stove, but he can't spell."
"You watch," Reuben told her. "Pa, may I have that BONE for PEP?"
Pep's ears picked up, and his tail thumped loudly on the floor. He gave a happy woof and looked expectantly toward the table.
Well, what do you know? Pa exclaimed. He acts as though he knows what you spelled.
Ma had to agree that Pep showed some intelligence, and the dog was soon gnawing contentedly on his bone. The next morning, Sarah Jane arrived with her doll, and I ran to get my doll, Emily. Ma asked us to gather a basket of nuts for her. "This is probably the last time we can get nuts," she said as she handed a basket to us. "It's going to snow soon." We agreed and took the basket, swinging it happily between us. Pep tagged along, passing now and then to sniff through a pile of leaves or run ahead as he spied a squirrel in the path.
"I sure do like Saturdays," Sarah Jane said. "Isn't it fun to just walk through the leaves and not be in a hurry to go somewhere?" "Yes, and I'd like it even better if we had a picnic lunch and could stay all day. But it's too cold for that now. By the time we get the nuts picked up, we'll be ready to start back." "How come Pep knows this is Saturday?" Sarah Jane wondered. "He never follows us to school, and we start out this same way. Do you think he can tell time?" "I wouldn't be surprised," I replied. "He's a very smart dog. Do you want to see how he can spell?" "No dog is that smart," Sarah Jane declared. "He can't even talk." "That's not the way he does it," I explained. "Look, I'll show you." I picked up a stick from the ground and held it over my head. "Here, Pep, go fetch the STICK." I threw it as far as I could, and Pep galloped after it, happy to have something to chase. He brought it back to me, and I turned triumphantly to Sarah Jane. "See?" "Oh, Mabel, he'd have brought that back if you had said go fetch the HOUSE. That doesn't prove that he can spell. It just proves that he likes to play games." "Anyway, he's smart, smarter than any dog I ever had." "You've never had another one," Sarah Jane pointed out. "Are you trying to say Pep is dumb?" I demanded. "Everything I say, you argue with me." "I won't argue any more," Sarah Jane promised. "Here, this tree has lots of nuts under it. Let's start here." We set the basket down and propped the two dolls up under the tree. "I think we can get the basket full in half an hour," I predicted. "There's a butternut tree over there, too, when we finish here." We worked quickly, partly because we were in a hurry to get home for the cookies Ma had promised us as a reward, and partly because it was getting much colder. "Oh, look, Sarah Jane, see what I found." I pointed to the maple tree near us. "There's a little clump of mistletoe up there. Let's get it, shall we?" "I'll watch you get it," she replied. "You know I can't climb a tree if I have to take my feet off the ground." "You can't climb anything if you don't take your feet off the ground," I said. "How come you're not afraid of falling out of bed at night?" "That's different. The bed is wider than a tree limb. I can just stay away from the edge." "Well, that isn't very far up," I declared. "I'll go up after it. Stand right there and I'll drop it down to you." The mistletoe was farther out than I had thought, so it took a while to work my way toward the end of the branch. "Oh, Mabel," Sarah Jane squeaked. "You can't pick the mistletoe and hang on to the branch at the same time. You'd better come down." "I'll hang on with one hand," I replied. But I was not able to do that. My other hand slipped and I plunged to the ground. I landed on my stomach with my arm bent under me. The wind was knocked out of me and I lay still with my eyes closed. "I didn't mean for you to come down that way," Sarah Jane screamed. "Mabel, are you dead?" When I could get my breath, I assured her that I was not, but I was hurt. "I'd better go and get your pa," Sarah Jane said anxiously. "I can't carry you home." "No, I'd rather have you stay here with me. I'll send Pep back for help. Pep," I called to him. "Go home and get Pa. Hurry." "Mabel, for goodness sake, you must have fallen on your head. That dog can't tell anyone what happened. Look here, he thinks you're playing another game."
It surely did look that way. After circling around me a few times, Pep grabbed Emily in his mouth and turned to run toward home.
"I'll wait just a few minutes, then I'm going myself," Sarah Jane declared. "It's too cold for you to be lying here on the ground."
By this time, I was able to pull myself up and lean against the tree. I was sure my arm was broken, and I knew my knee was too sore to walk, but I was confident that Pep would get the message home and help would be on the way. When Pep dashed up on our porch at home, Ma was working at the stove. He scratched the door, but Ma didn't turn around.
"You don't come in at this time of day," she said to him. "Go on about your business."
Pep turned and ran to the barn. Reuben met him at the door.
"What are you doing with Mabel's doll? You're going to be in trouble if you lose that. Here, give it to me."
Pep refused to give up the doll. Instead, he turned and ran a short way and then stopped. When Reuben started after him, he kept just a few feet ahead, looking back to be sure that he was being followed.
"Pa," Reuben called, "I think something has happened to Mabel. Pep has her doll in his mouth and he acts like he wants us to follow him."
It wasn't long before we heard Pep's familiar bark and Pa and Reuben calling our names.
"See what I told you?"
I said to Sarah Jane. She was so happy to see Pa and Reuben coming towards us. She didn't even answer me. Instead, she jumped up, waving her hands in the air.
"Over here, Mr. Odell."
Soon Pa was scooping me up in his arms, and I was on my way home. That evening, after the excitement was over, Ma bent down and hugged Pep.
"I guess you're good for something after all, old fellow," she said. "I won't doubt your intelligence next time. And the next BONE you get will have some MEAT on it."
End of chapter 4.